Kia ora, hello, and welcome to a new season of Play Notes, the podcast where we give you the lowdown on the plays and playwrights you need to know. I'm your host, Emily Duncan.
And I'm your other host, Allison Horsley. And we are dramaturgs, script advisors, narrative nerds, story demons, drama divas and demons and...
Script Sallies, is that what you said before we started recording?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
It wasn't, I'm glad that I'm a little embarrassed that you brought it back, but...
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. We're doing Chekhov today.
We are. So if you haven't listened to our first season, which we actually recorded 2 years ago, so you can go back and listen to those. There's 9 episodes. This season, our second season, we are sort of dividing it in half. So we've got 3 episodes devoted to Anton Chekhov.
Everybody's favorite playwright.
Yes, and Allison's a real expert about this, so
that's
very
terrifying.
Lucky. And then in episodes 4 to 6, we are going to be spotlighting 3 local women playwrights.
Woo! None of them are Russian or named Anton Chekhov.
Yeah. Or they've all got strong connections to Oti Dunedin.
Yes.
We were recording this, we should say.
Yes.
Yeah.
So super exciting. So
and
it's a
unlike
season of 2
Chekhov,
halves.
they're alive and kicking.
Yes, they are. Look, Chekhov could still be out there somewhere.
Nice.
I mean, probably
Preserved
probably
in
not.
that oyster cart.
Right. That's right. Yeah. It was raw oysters.
Yeah.
That's true.
If you don't know that story, maybe look it up.
Yeah, you should. Just what could go wrong? Just Google oysters and Chekhov. So, Emily Duncan, what are the plays? Which Chekhov plays are we talking about? Which one are we doing today?
Well, today we're doing what I like to call the salty side-eye play, the Seagull.
Yeah. In the Ruski, it's chaika. That's the word.
For Seagull.
Yeah.
And
actually,
just before we
yes.
dive in,
Yeah.
okay, I think I asked you this in a text message or a message.
Yes.
I hadn't actually ever clicked, almost 25 years after first reading this play, that it wouldn't actually be a seagull.
Yeah, totally not a seagull. This is a landlocked place. It is a lake. So chaika actually just refers, it's just a gull. It's a type of gull. So when it was first translated into English, though, somebody chose seagull, which, of course, in at least American English, and I'm maybe not here in Dunedin where like they're the little bastards who steal our chips, but like in American English, seagulls are kind of romantic and they're free.
Really?
You know, oh yeah, they're beautiful. You know, they're kind of, well, I think because in the States we don't have albatross, so it's like, you know, so a seagull is kind of perceived as like living this, I don't know, kind of romantic life. And
Whereas
so,
here they're sky rats.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And so, whereas in Chekhov's day, a chaika is just a type of bird, really. And seagull just gives it a different level of romanticism.
Okay. Now, when he wrote this play, it wasn't his first play. He'd written another full-length play that he'd been quite successful, or very successful with. He was a successful short story writer. He'd written some one-act plays as well. And The Seagull was a real departure for him.
Yes.
In terms of the style he was writing. And we could almost think of this as, I like to think of it as second play syndrome. Second full-length play syndrome. He's gone out on a limb, tried something different, and the first production is a disaster.
Yeah, first production, not the best. He pretty much hated it so much he left St. Petersburg. So first production was at one of the Imperial Theaters that was in St. Petersburg, which at the time that was the capital of Russia.
And so this is 1896 when he wrote it.
Yeah, and that's when it premieres at the Alexandrinsky Theater, which is this big, beautiful, gilded theater. It's still there. And that night was a benefit, kind of, not like a benefit concert, but it was supposed to be a benefit for a comic actress. And so I think that the expectation on the part of the audience was that it was going to be like rip-roaring comedy. And also the style of the plays that usually went up there were a little bit more of a, what we would think of now as more of a melodramatic presentational kind of thing. Even though at the time it was quote unquote realism, our definition of realism and their definition of realism are a little bit different. But Chekhov was writing a new kind of realism, almost like naturalism, which, you know, that can be splitting hair sometimes, but he was trying something different and also infusing it a little bit with some symbolism, which was also more of a breaking art form at the time. Which also tried to get at truth, but in a more symbolic way, as the term suggests. So Chekhov puts this thing on stage with these actors who aren't used to doing that style of play that he's written, and needless to say, doesn't go super, super well. It wasn't like the worst. It wasn't the worst theatrical failure Russia had ever seen, but it was not great. And it made him want to not write for a while.
All right. But we're going to meet a couple of other people who encourage him to remount this work a couple of years later.
Yeah, and this was a time of great, social change in Russia, but in the 1880s, the whole system opened up from only being an imperial theater monopoly to smaller companies being able to get started up. And so all these little theaters were cropping up slowly but surely around Russia who could produce work that they were more interested in. They were all still subject to censorship, though, but that's how the Moscow Art Theater was able to exist. Like, it could not have existed 20 years before, because it was illegal to start a theater that was like that.
And so probably the most well-known name associated with the Moscow Art Theatre, and often gets lumped together with Chekhov, we can talk about that in a moment, is Stanislavski.
Yes.
And maybe we will talk about this now. They're sort of presented as a package deal.
Yeah, people are like, oh, that's the method. That's Chekhov is all realism, la 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 la. Yeah. Stanislavski didn't come into it with Chekhov until a little bit later. I mean, Chekhov put the play on at the Alexandrinsky, but Stanislavski and Nemirovich Danchenko hadn't started the Moscow Art Theater yet, so yeah. So they existed independently of each other for a while, and then they got fused together, and then I think as Chekhov died and Stanislavski survived him, they got tied together permanently.
Yeah. And also we have plays by Ibsen predating Chekhov's plays. We have Emile Zola in France, and he's already written at least a decade before about naturalism in theatre.
Yeah.
So it's not as if they just come out of a vacuum.
No. And certainly a lot of stuff happening in Germany, some stuff happening in Belgium. And this also coincides with photography. And so there's a general effort in artistic circles to create a depiction of something that looks more quote unquote real. And of course, as a backlash against that, then we've got symbolism and other stuff that comes in that's like, screw you, realism. I can get truth by doing weird shit. That's kind of what it is. And I can try and present what we see in dreams on stage. And that's more real than your quote unquote real fake wall and your real looking clothes and stuff like that. So a lot of organizations were trying to out-real each other. So in 1902, that was when The Lower Depths premiered in Moscow. That was the Gorky play. And they had taken the clothing from local homeless shelters and stuff. So the front rows of I think it was at the Moscow Art Theater, were talking about getting overwhelmed by lice and vermin and stuff coming out of the clothing that they were using because it was so quote unquote real. So it was a reel off, which is not uncommon, I think, for audiences today because, have you looked at Netflix? All reality TV, 90 Day Fiancé, all that stuff. Anyway.
And Stanislavski, so he gets, well, rightly, he's associated with what we now term the method. He would have termed it his system more so. And, that's a whole other big meaty topic for a whole other series,
yes,
I think.
Yes.
And if people are really interested in that, a book I would highly recommend is The Method by Isaac Butler. He puts it in context over decades. Something people might be familiar with if they're not familiar with all the machinations of the method is that it can sometimes be assumed almost be a sort of self-indulgent form of acting. It's very internal. I might think of Marlon Brando, mumbling. But as you said earlier, Allison, you referred to truth. And emotional truth is really what everyone was sort of aiming for. It was just more a case of how are we going to get there?
Yeah. Yeah. And with Seagull, I think Chekhov does an interesting thing where he examines the art that was happening at the time. And it's a play about the theater, and it's a play about new art forms emerging in the theater. So it's very self-referential in this way. And I think that's probably why the first production didn't do so well, because it's got a play within a play, and the play within the play is somewhat symbolist, as opposed to the rest of the play that it's housed in, which is quite realist. And so if you do a production where you're making fun of one or the other, which usually people make fun of the symbolist play that the character Triplev has written, you can make fun of it, but it can't be too ridiculous, or else then we dismiss him as an artist and as a character. Which I realize, before we go too far into this, should we do a bit of a plot summary of Seagull?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we're on a rural estate. It's a family that lives there, and a famous actress, Arkadina, who's a famous middle-aged actress, we'll say, has come back to visit with her boyfriend in tow, and her boyfriend is a famous writer. And the people who normally live on the estate are Arkadina's son, Triplev, and her brother, and a few other people who are essentially running the farm, because it's like this estate kind of farm. So Arkadina shows up with Trigorin, who's the boyfriend / writer. Triplev has written a play starring his girlfriend, who's a local girl named Nina, and his play is, very deep and very symbolist, and it's very
earnest.
It's very earnest. It's very much about what will the world look like, in 100,000 years, what shades will still exist? It's very deep and very earnest. And his mother kind of dismisses it. And he stops, Triplev stops the show. That's Konstantin Kostya is also Triplev. See, all the names. But he stops the show, and he's super hurt by it. And then the rest of the play is kind of the fallout after that. So his girlfriend Nina ends up sort of falling in love with Trigorin, who's this older writer. And of course, Kostya is very jealous of that, because Nina had been his girlfriend.
Muse and girlfriend.
Yeah. Oh, totally. His muse. Yeah. And whereas Trigorin, who is very obviously with Arkadina, is kind of like, ooh, younger lady. Yes, I'm interested. He's one of those dudes. So that happens over time in the course of the first few acts. And then the fourth act. Well, why don't you pick it up here at the fourth act? What happens in the fourth act? Well, the fourth
act is at least a couple of years later.
Yeah, it's 2 years later.
Isn't it? And so the family, everyone's back on the estate. Mm-hmm. And we learn a bit about Nina's really tragic life, since she took a huge artistic and life risk by leaving her hometown and the estate to pursue a life working in the arts. And it's just
and living with Trigorin.
Yeah.
Like, she goes to the big city, she goes to Moscow, he puts her up, it's, yeah.
Yeah, and the plays by Chekhov, as I understand, was referred to a comedy in 4 acts.
Yes.
And I think if you only read the fourth act alone, you'd probably really struggle to find that comedy.
Yeah, not comedy at all.
Today will come with all sorts of content warnings.
Yes. Yeah, but yeah, so the fourth act, well, should we say what happens in the fourth act? Or?
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean, if you don't like spoilers, this is probably not the podcast for you. We have to go into spoilers.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Yeah, so Nina shows up. So Triplev has become a more famous writer, which is kind of cool. Nina shows up. She's like haggard after the last couple of years that she's had with Trigorin.
She's lost a child.
She has lost her sense of wonder about the world. She repeats some of a monologue that she had done in the first act, which had been the one that Kostya had written. And this time she repeats it, and it's clear that this time it's with everything that she now knows about the world. And so what had been this kind of earnest, possibly silly kind of speech that she delivers in Act 1, she re-delivers in Act 4. And that's one of my favorite parts of the play, because it's just devastating when you hear her and you see her do it again, and it's this little recall of their youth together, and of all this
heartbreaking poignancy.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's sort of come full circle in a really cruel way.
Yeah, and she's referring to herself as the Seagull because earlier in the play, Constantine shoots a seagull, number one, and then later on, Trigorin...
He as a gift, could we say, to Nina?
Oh, yeah. Constantine shoots the seagull and is like, here.
I did this for you.
Yeah. She's like, great. Okay. Awesome.
I don't know what you want me to do with that.
Well, yeah. And then later it gets stuffed in the play. It's stuffed and like mounted and put in the house.
Yes.
And then Trigorin has noticed earlier in the play, he had noticed it and said, oh, that's a good idea for a short story, is somebody comes along and shoots a seagull simply because they can. Mm-hmm. And later on in the play, she's like, I'm the seagull, that's me. And so she, in this famous speech, she says, I am the seagull, I'm the seagull. And she kind of like wigs out and then leaves. And the family comes back on, and Arkadina is sort of holding court, doing the thing that she always does. Everybody's there. Triplev goes off stage, and he shoots himself. And is now a good time?
I think we should talk about names.
Oh, yeah.
Because we've touched on the names, and this is something that pretty much everyone who's not familiar with Russian would struggle to get their heads around. Mm-hmm. Why do people have so many goddamn names, Allison?
Okay, so people have a bunch of names because, all right, there's the family name, which is, well, why don't we use a name as an example from the play?
Okay.
So there's Irina Nikolaevna Arkadina is our main character. Irina is the name that her parents chose for her, and often in Russian plays, people say, oh, it's my name day. And that means often there will be a particular saint's day. And so girls that are born on that day often are given that saint's name.
Right.
So it is the birthday, but it's also the saint's day. So, or our name day. Mm-hmm. So it can either be a name that your family likes, or it can be the name of a saint whose day that is on which you're born. So in her case, her name is Irina. That was her parents, the name her parents chose for her. Nikolaevna is her father's name with a gender appropriate ending. And it's a way of keeping track of whose kid is whose when you're living in some sort of rural town.
Okay.
A lot of people in Russia until like World War I didn't have last names because they didn't need them because they weren't traveling anywhere. And if you're in one town and you're so-and-so Grigorievich, it's like, yep, Grigori's his dad. That's what you need to know. That's
what
it.
you need to know.
Yeah, but in the case of Chekhov's plays, generally his characters have the first name, the patronymic, which is what that middle name is, which is their father's name with a gender-appropriate ending, a gender that matches their gender.
So patronymic, I think, patriarch.
Yeah, exactly.
The father.
Yeah, I mean, that tells you a lot about Russia too, right?
Patriarchy.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, and it's funny that like often in the descriptions you'll notice that the servants like only have one name. Because it's like, we don't care who their father is, you know, like it's interesting. And it tells you a lot. Like in Chekhov, if you're reading a good translation of it, it tells you a lot about what the relationship is between characters. Because in Russia, if you use somebody's first name and their patronymic, it's a sign of respect.
Right.
But if you just talk to them using their nickname, either you're treating them like a child or you know them really well or something.
Okay.
You know, so whereas in New Zealand, we tend to use nicknames really easily.
Yes.
But in Russia, especially at that time, no. Like the way that names are used is really indicative of the relationship between people. So, and in the case of Irina Nikolaevna Arkadina, Arkadina is actually a stage name.
Right.
So,
refer to.
Yeah.
So with her son, Kostya.
Yes.
And I was saying to you before we started recording, how come he gets 4 names?
He has all the names.
Yeah.
It's because the name that she chose for him is Konstantin, and his nickname is Kostya. So even though in Russian, usually the quote-unquote masculine nouns end with a consonant often, when it comes to nicknames, they have a more of a feminine ending, which you can derive all kinds of like conclusions about that. But the easier way to say it is that like the cuter something becomes, or the more diminutive it becomes, to my mind, in Russian language, the more feminine it becomes. So like,
it denotes a level of familiarity.
Yeah. So you can have someone named Pyotr, and then their nickname can be Petya, but then it can also go to like Petrushka and like all of the stuff. And the longer the nickname gets, the cuter and squishier they become.
Okay.
You know, so there's that in all of this as well.
Right.
So it's confusing because sometimes men's names can end with like an A or something like that. But the patronymics are going to tell you who siblings are, which is that's going to come up in Cherry Orchard,
right,
in particular, because you know who has a shared father because they have the same patronymic.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a really great crash lesson. Happy to help. I've learned so much. So they do this. There's the remount of the Seagull at the Moscow Art Theatre, and this time it is a success.
It's a success because Stanislavski and Nemirovich Donchenko, who's pretty much a dramaturg, and Stanislavski is a director, they create a theater that they call the Moscow Art Theater. They convince Chekhov to let them produce Seagull or remount Seagull. And specifically, this is Nemirovich Donchenko who's done this because he and Chekhov were friends, and Nemirovich Donchenko liked Chekhov's writing. So they convinced Chekhov to let them restage Seagull. And this time, holy crap, it's successful! And all of a sudden, it's like this defining moment in Russian theater, so much so that they end up putting the
Seagull emblem as their logo.
Yeah, and it's still there today.
Right.
And even if you look at the Moscow Art Theater logo, it's very like Art Nouveau looking, or what I would think of as kind of Art Nouveau looking, and that tells you a lot about the changing style of theater. You know, that you figure like 20 years
organic, smooth, curved lines.
Very smooth lines and very modern looking, as opposed to what it could have been even 30 years before, which would have been more like ornate and stuff. So that tells you about the style of theater they were trying to do in a more basic type of theater that wasn't as frou-frou. They were trying to get down to like the brass tacks realism of it.
Something we haven't touched on is why Chekhov took this risk with his second play. What had happened in his life between his successful farcical works and then coming back and writing this piece.
Right.
So he trained as a doctor.
Yes.
And he was essentially the breadwinner for his family. And he actually made more money, am I correct, by writing short stories?
Yeah. He was published pretty widely. And his father, who had been a merchant, like a grocer in Taganrog, which is like a port city, had gone bankrupt when Chekhov was like, I want to say he was like 7 or something. And so the family ended up moving to Moscow, leaving him like to finish his education in Taganrog.
So much pressure.
Yeah. And so he became like the breadwinner of the family. And he had a couple brothers. One of them had a lot of issues with alcohol, which not uncommon for Russian men at the time, and even now, frankly. But yeah, he was stuck trying to make money for the family.
And shortly around the time he graduates from medical school, he is diagnosed with tuberculosis, and he doesn't actually tell anyone in his family at this point. That's the level of pressure he's feeling.
Right.
And he takes a job as a census worker, I think we might say nowadays, and you're going to tell me how to pronounce the name of the island.
Oh, Sakhalin Island, which was a penal colony, which Tsarist Russia was really good at doing that.
So even though he's had quite a challenging life, the couple of years he's on the island, he sees a even far grittier, more challenging type of life than he's ever really encountered before.
Yeah. And the journey itself is grueling. It took like 2 months to get there.
Yeah.
You know, and if he's somebody who's got issues with health in the first place, can you imagine traveling for 2 months over carriage in a country that's that big? And there's actually a word in Russian for roadlessness, which is like the time of year when the roads are so muddy they're not passable.
Okay.
Like if you can imagine, you know, being in like a buggy, you know, or whatever, and or trying to get there.
You can't just hop on the red eye and get back.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there were trains and stuff, but yeah, it was rough.
Yeah.
So he goes to Sakhalin Island and basically does a census, but then also like writes extensively about the experience of the people living there. And like, and largely because of that, like we think of him as a humanist or somebody who, you know, who really prized humanity the value of an individual human being over. I mean, that at one point I think he says that's his religion, that humans or the human being is his religion, and that's his temple above anything else. So he at one point declared himself an atheist. Anyway.
Returning from there.
Yeah, so he's done all of that. So all of a sudden his perspective on the world is quite different. I mean, Ivanov, which was his first play, it still got a bit of a dark ending. And it's funny because Ivanov also ends in suicide. And this time in Seagull ends in suicide. But in a...
So the journey to get there is...
Yeah.
tempered differently.
Yeah. Ivanov, the suicide is very sudden. I mean, it comes out of nowhere. And with Seagull, though, it's a process.
Which is probably a good time for us to talk about this term, Chekhov's gun.
Yeah.
Which people may or may not have heard of, but it's something you probably should be familiar with if you want to get to grips with Chekhov. And it's this idea that, especially if a significant prop is introduced at some point in the play.
In like Act 1.
Yes, it needs to
pay
off later, and it certainly does in Seagull, as we've talked about.
Yeah, and this is something that, I mean, it's a personal beef that I have that I've at least in the States, I was aware of at least one adaptation of Seagull where somebody was like, how do we know he kills himself at the end? You know, maybe it's just another attempt. And it's like, actually, the Russian language makes it very clear that, like, the first...
deed is done.
Yeah, that he attempts suicide earlier in the play, and he misses his head. But at the end of the play, succeeds in finishing the task.
There's one other context term we want to cover for this episode. We're going to go into more about the social setting in episode 2 for this season. And that is the local council, as I understand it.
Yeah. So the local councils came out of the liberation of the serfs, which happened in 1861. Basically, Russia had been a feudal system where landholders had vast amounts of land, which makes me think of Monty Python. But and serfs or peasants basically working the land, and the feudal lord basically owned the serfs. Once the serfs were liberated in 1861, that required more of a democratization of government around Russia. And it was so freaking big that basically what the government did is they allowed councils to spring up in more like localities, and they could be self-governing. So there would be a council, an elected council who ran the Zemstvo, which is the word that comes up. And that word comes up in quite a few of his plays. And they're just a local electoral body, or a locally elected body who runs things. And eventually, like, the land would be redistributed among the formerly freed serfs, and that ultimately was going to lead to the Russian Revolution because people weren't able to actually live off the land anymore, and they ended up like moving to the cities and blah blah blah. So Chekhov was here for the thick of it.
All right, so we're pretty much the end of episode 1. We're going to jump into Uncle Vanya in episode 2.
Yes.
But we always like to finish with what are our favourite bits. I managed to narrow myself down to 1.
I, as always, was undecided, but I think I was able to pick one.
Okay.
So do you want to start with yours?
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, I think of this as the salty side-eye play. And that's because there's quite a bit of dissing that goes on about each other's work. And there's one line, I wouldn't know, I haven't read them, which to me has big Mariah Carey energy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because that's the moment where I think it's in Act 4, maybe? No, it's maybe it's right when Trigorin has arrived that somebody is like, hey, Triplev, how's his writing? And
I wouldn't know, I haven't read them.
yeah, which is like, oh, well, for me, my favorite part, I have a few different favorite parts of this play, but it's the hurtful honesty within a couple of these characters, and particularly with Arkadna. She is so self-absorbed. That there's this one scene where her brother Soren is trying to get her to to give Tripleov a hand
Support
up.
him.
So, to support him, give him some money. You know, don't you understand? He lives a tough life.
He's walking around in rags, essentially.
He has an old suit, and she just says, "Will I never be free of this?" Like exclaiming to herself and just saying like, "Oh, the world is out to get me," and it's like it's so awful that it's one of my favorite parts of the play because that's how horrible I am. But people are so blunt with each other in a surprising way in this play, you know, and people just break each other's hearts left and right, in that horrible way that we all do, you know, where we don't realize how sincere someone is being, so we say something and then break their heart. And that's kind of what happens in that moment too.
Great. Join us for episode 2 on Uncle Vanya.
Yeah, and stay safe. Thanks, everybody.